What's going on, everybody? Back again with another episode of the Baptist Directory. This is Dr. Michael Schultz, and I'm looking forward to today because it's a special episode. Most of our episodes cycle through the 4 centuries of the last few centuries of Baptist history, the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, and 1900s. But today, on a 5th episode, we're going to be doing a special episode on a Baptist institution, and maybe in the future we'll do certain events in Baptist history. So I've chosen today to look at the Roger Williams University, which was in Nashville, Tennessee from 1864 to 1929. And as the first non-person discussed on this channel, you might wonder why I've chosen such a small Baptist college that existed for only about 65 years before dissolving through various mergers. And I have 2 reasons that I want to talk about Roger Williams. Roger Williams University, first of all, is to me an example of what's historically happened to most Baptist institutions of higher learning. It exemplifies this trend in Baptist history where godly men and women work to build something wonderful and meaningful on the grounds of doctrinal fidelity and biblical faithfulness, only to see it swallowed up in a tidal wave of secularism and cultural disdain for tradition. But secondly, which is entirely opposite to the first, I find Roger Williams to be a very unique example that's unlike most others. It was an institution in the American South founded explicitly for the purpose of educating black individuals even before the Civil War ended. And beyond that, its time of existence was through the wide Reconstruction era, and one could even argue that its dissolution coincided with the rise of the Jim Crow South. So much of its history has to do with racial strife, but it's not a social justice-oriented institution. Its very existence, quite frankly, surprises me. So for those reasons, I believe it's a story that deserves to be told, and I hope you enjoy listening to it today. Even among those who have attempted to write the history or chronicle the history of Roger Williams University, there's an overlooked beginning that I think I want to point out, which is that the beginnings of Roger Williams University are found at the hand of a guy named Heman Lincoln Wayland, better known as H.L. Wayland. Dr. Wayland was the son of the famous Francis Wayland, who was the president of Brown University, and he was the younger brother of Francis Wayland III, who was the dean of the Yale Law School. Now, I mentioned the elder Francis Wayland in the episode on John Laidley Dagg. He was the man who wrote a very popular book entitled Elements of Moral Science in 1835, which noteworthily advocated against slavery, and that led to John Dagg writing his Elements of Moral Science in 1859, I believe it was, and he advocated for slavery in that book. The Wayland family was convictionally against slavery. And so when the Civil War began, H.L. Wayland, the son, was commissioned as a chaplain in Company S of the 7th Regiment Connecticut Volunteers on the 18th of September, 1861. And he served honorably. He was recommissioned once more on Christmas Eve, 1862, before leaving the service on New Year's Day, 1864. And that summer, the summer of 1864, the American Baptist Home Mission Society, which, if you don't know the history of these denominations, that would be the Northern Baptist Convention, if you wanted to consider it that way. When the Northern and Southern Baptist Conventions split, 1840-ish, of course, really it happened in 1845, but the 1841 Triennial Convention was the beginning of that. See the episode on John Laidley Dagg. The American Baptist Home Mission Society is the equivalent of the Southern Baptist Convention's North American Mission Board. Consider it that way. And the American Baptist Home Mission Society appointed H.L. Wayland to Nashville to serve as a missionary teacher there. Now again, this is during the Civil War, 1864, and he starts there on the 1st of June, 1864, teaching groups of both black and white men in Nashville. And he continued doing this until February of 1865, when he received the appointment to serve as a professor of rhetoric and logic at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. So the American Baptist Home Mission Society responded by reassigning a Welshman named Daniel W. Phillips to Nashville from his post where he was in Knoxville. And he'd only been in Knoxville since August of 1864, so moving in February of 65 wasn't really a major change for him. When he was appointed, the American Baptist Home Mission Society publicly announced to the people of Nashville, "This brother of South Reading, Massachusetts is the ablest man that we have in all of New England." And so this guy comes with a lot of pomp and circumstance. He was a graduate of Brown University and Newton Theological Institution. Really well educated, really well spoken. And as one would expect, he had more immediate success preaching initially to a white congregation. He was brought in at Central Baptist Church in Nashville, but he soon recognized that there was this booming population of freed blacks that had migrated to Nashville. And so, just to give you some background on that, the black population of Nashville tripled in this era, with many of them coming out of slavery, looking for work, some of them simply fleeing from previous owners in search of a new life. So Phillips began holding classes in his own basement just for black young men to come and study. And his initial intent was to get them to a level of reading, writing, and mathematical proficiency that we would consider today about a fourth grade level. Which, to be honest, that was quite a lot. I mean, you imagine being the age of 20, 25, 30, having never read, having never written, having never done math, trying to learn it now. Many of us can't learn a new language, so this was no small undertaking for him to want to help these freedmen get to a fourth grade level. There was a black minister named Randall B. Vandervelde, who later on, he wrote about Dr. Phillips. He said, "We went with him over the city, and he ate at our tables, as poor as we were. He identified himself with us to lift us up and to bring to us a way of life and to open up a way by which we might be educated." And so Dr. Phillips seems to have really identified not just with the Christian whites in Nashville, not just with Americans, though he was a Welshman, not just with the uneducated, although he was very well educated, but with the poor and the black and the recently freed men that many people of his era wouldn't have spent any time with. And the classes in his basement became so popular that he had to quickly look for a larger space to hold them in. He initially found a space in the basement of the First Colored Baptist Mission, which today is the Spruce Street Baptist Church in Nashville. And Phillips went on teaching in that atmosphere for about a year or more, and at this point he just called the institution the Baptist College. When the Civil War formally ended in 1865, the school grew beyond the capacity of even that church. And so they began using an old Union Army barracks on the nearby corner of Cedar and Spruce Streets in Nashville. They purchased it for $1,000, and that became their new meeting place. And that served them for about another year until in 1866 the school was officially named the Nashville Normal and Theological Institute by the American Baptist Home Mission Society that began taking ownership and a vested interest in it. Now when I say Normal Institute, if you don't have some background on this, normal colleges or normal institutes in the 1800s, that was a name for what we would now call like a teacher school. They taught pedagogy and things like that you would need to know if you wanted to go into education, to be an administrator or to be a teacher or a faculty member. So this was a school not just meant for training people on how to read, write, and do arithmetic, but teaching people how to be teachers. And so with this formal background, Phillips began searching for a place to establish a permanent institution. And he found it in a more accommodating plot of ground on the southeast corner of Park and Polk Streets. He invested another $4,000, and he took that two-story framed building from the Union Barracks, he disassembles it, he moves it, and has it reassembled on the new site. And so here he's got this 120 by 40 foot, two-story high building that has recitation rooms and a chapel and a library and accommodations for about 45 men and 12 women. And he begins having this full-time school that he offers. And the first classes at this new building were held in August of 1867. So this has already been 3 years in the making that he's been working on this school before it ever officially opens. And in 1869, Dr. Phillips and the American Baptist Home Mission Society attempted to purchase a nearby fort, a former Union Army property called Fort Gillem, but they were outbid. They were outbid by Fisk University, and if you want to go to that site, it's now called Jubilee Hall at Fisk University. You can see that. I think that was built in 1876. Looking at the centennial year, I may be wrong about that. But from the beginning, they knew that they were at a disadvantage. Number one, because they were a black school. It was a school aimed specifically at freed men, freed blacks. And also, they knew that this demographic that they were aiming at was notoriously poor, as you would expect. And so they had to keep costs as low as possible. Some students had churches pay for them to attend. There was one guy named Alan Allensworth. We'll talk about him later. He received $50 toward tuition from the church that he attended. They had this Second Baptist Church in Ohio that had a society that they themselves funded called the Judson Missionary Society. And so they sent $50 to put him through school in 1872. Some of the other students were sponsored by the American Baptist Home Mission Society themselves. Hardin Smith and Martin Winfield, a couple of guys we'll talk about later on. They were from Haywood County, Tennessee. The ABHMS funded them to go. And so these guys were receiving what we would call scholarships. And it's important because these guys were, like I said, freed slaves. Hardin Smith had been born to Abner Smith, who was a white slave owner. His dad was his owner. He was from Hanover County, Virginia, and his mother was one of the slaves. And so he'd been sold several times. When he was 11 years old, he was sold and brought to Haywood County, Tennessee. And Martin Winfield came from a similar background. So these two guys, they get scholarships from the ABHMS to become students here at what is the Nashville Normal and Theological Institute. And they would have never had this experience or opportunities without the sponsorship of the Mission Society or the opportunities that were granted through this school. So this was just a godsend for people of this era. Now, support for the school didn't just come through local churches or through the American Baptist Home Mission Society. Dr. Phillips also managed to procure support from many of the wealthy whites in the area. There was one guy, Dr. William Palmer Jones. He lived from 1819 to 97. He was a doctor, a physician in the local area, and at one point he was actually elected president of the Tennessee Baptist Convention. He was elected several times over. He was a state senator in 1873, and he helped fund and finance the school when it was getting started. There was another doctor, Dr. Jabez Philander Dake, born 1827, died 1894. He was from Rhode Island, but he still had a great esteem for Roger Williams University. He had a great esteem for all Baptist education in the South, and specifically Baptist education for free blacks. And so he vigorously supported the institution. In 1874, there was a new organization founded called the Negro Baptist Convention of Tennessee. They financially contributed. And so despite all the difficulties that the institution faced, they had a lot of support. They had hard times coming. In 1870, Tennessee repealed this law that offered free public education to blacks, but the Roger Williams Institute stayed open. And there was so much support that in 1874, new income was brought in from sympathetic figures nationwide, and they began looking for a new campus. They had outgrown their current campus. They had money to spare. And so there was a guy named J.B. Simmons, who was a graduate of Brown University and the secretary of the Home Mission Society at the time. And he came to Nashville to look for an ideal site where they could plant this campus. And he spent a month searching, and he finally settled on a property that was for sale by a guy named William H. Gordon on Hillsborough Pike. This is about a mile and a half south of Nashville, between what was then the newly founded Vanderbilt University and the Belmont Mansion. Now, initially, the ABHMS was hesitant to undertake the task. This was like a 30-acre tract, and it had enclosure by walls. It had orchards and gardens and pastures for livestock, and it was priced at $1,000 an acre. And that $30,000 price tag was quite off-putting, but Dr. Phillips reached out to an old friend he had from Brown University, a guy named Nathan Bishop, and he supplied the money for the purchase. And so for all of his work, all of his accumulative efforts, along with other alumni, Brown University actually awarded Dr. Phillips a Doctor of Divinity degree in 1874 when Roger Williams University purchased their first campus. Now, I should say, at this point, again, they're still known as the Normal School, the Theological Institute of Nashville. It was not called the Roger Williams Institute, the Roger Williams University just yet. That came much later. But I'm using that name because this is what it's known as historically, and Dr. Phillips really worked to build this. No matter what the name was, he wanted for there to be an institution of higher learning for free blacks at rock-bottom cost to give them the opportunities that he had growing up in Wales and also in getting his further education in the United States in the American North. Now, getting into the post-Reconstruction era, the only building on campus when it was purchased in 1874 was a two-story home called the Mansion House, or sometimes the Old Gordon Home. It had been built in the 1850s, so it was relatively new. It was on a hilltop where today Peabody College's, what used to be called the Social and Religious Building, it's now called the Fay and Joe Wyatt Center for Education. If you go to Nashville today, you go on Peabody College's campus, you can see that building. That's where the Mansion House was. In 1875, a year after purchasing the campus, Roger Williams University added a third story onto the mansion and put a new roof on it and converted it to be used as apartments for teachers and dorms for female students. In 1876, the next year, they built a three-story building with 160 foot of frontage right next to it that they connected to it with hallways, and that building they called Centennial Hall. That's probably where I got the previous idea for Jubilee Hall. I've probably got that wrong, but I'm not going to go back and redo all this. So they have Centennial Hall built in 1876, 100 years after the American Revolution, and that building cost them $45,000 to build. So where did they get the money for that? Well, Dr. Phillips goes back to his old friend, Nathan Bishop, and he again contributes $28,000 to build that. And this building served as male dorms. Both buildings were devoted to having classrooms in them, and both buildings were open by October of 1876. So the school's growing, but not just in terms of brick and mortar growth. The faculty of the school also began to take on great growth. There was a lady named Carrie V. Ryer that was added to the faculty in 1870 before the new campus was procured. And she had really strong convictions against slavery, and this forged her love and devotion towards seeing anybody in the black race brought out of this position of subjugation that they were in following the Civil War, and it fostered in her this desire to assist in whatever way that she could. There was another person named Lyman Beecher Teft, who was a graduate of Brown University as well as Rochester Theological Seminary. Mr. Teft came on faculty in 1874 and began taking up major positions on offering intensives for teachers in the summer semesters. So up to this point, the school was mostly for reading, writing, arithmetic, some theological instruction, of course, because their primary leader was a pastor. But Teft came in and said, we can turn this into a real teacher school. Most of the students had been gaining basic literacy and mathematical ability. Teft says we need to be teaching people how to be teachers and get the educational caliber up to speed so that these teachers can go out and start other schools. And so in 1877, the school began offering a Bachelor of Arts degree for the first time. And a member of the first graduating class of what was at that point known as the Nashville Institute was Charles Spencer Dinkins, born 1856, died 1901. And he would begin teaching at the Institute the year after he graduated, while also undergoing further studies at Newton Theological Institute. He was born a slave, and when he was an elderly man, he was the president of Selma University in Selma, Alabama. So you see what a big difference this school made. He goes from being born a slave to getting an education at the Nashville Institute, going on to graduate education, and becoming the president of a school that's a historical black college and university in the American South. Another guy brought on was a guy named L.B. Fish. He was a pastor of Third Baptist Church in Nashville, and he was a widely admired tenor in musical circles, really talented musical guy. And so he begins teaching vocal music for several years at the Nashville Institute. Dr. Phillips actually made a note of him. He says he was the only pastor that was not ashamed of us. And he was one of the very few that would have anything to do with us. And so although they had support, don't let me mislead you into thinking that the city of Nashville just came around them and loved this idea. There were very few people in the local area who were willing to stand tall and actually support this institution and what they were doing. By 1881, Dr. Phillips starts stepping away from his responsibilities, and fair enough, he's been doing this for 15 years at that point. Lyman Teft becomes the principal of the school, which practically speaking is what we would call the president of the university, with Dr. Phillips becoming more of what we would call a chancellor. And Dr. Phillips continued teaching theology courses, but he began relinquishing some of his administrative oversight. And to supplement the loss of Dr. Phillips' leadership in that regard, they put together this executive board to oversee the school that had several longtime supporters serving as trustees. And that board would become actually a big part of the institution's history. We'll talk about that later on. Now, Mr. Teft, he recommended to this board that they incorporate immediately so that they can begin legally offering degrees as a university. And this was something that Dr. Phillips had stopped them from doing in the past. He was entirely opposed to it because he said that becoming a university would turn them away from what should be their true aim. That's an exact quote from him. His concern was that when they became a university, they would turn the school away from their roots of training people to be teachers and ministers, and that it would become more secularly aimed. And to his credit, no school of the American Baptist Home Mission Society had ever offered college-level work before. This was something that not only did he think was a bad idea, but the ABHMS had never done it before. They had never started a college or a university. They had theological institutions, but no colleges. But to his surprise, he lost the debate. And they went forward with becoming a university. And to his credit, he still signed on as one of the signatories when they became an official university in 1883. Now, when they went forward with incorporation, they needed a name. And the need for a name was rather easy to fill because from the beginning, almost all of the men involved in building the institution, whether it be Wayland in the early days, or Phillips, or J.B. Simmons, or financiers like Nathan Bishop or Jabez Dake, they all shared a common experience. They all either attended Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, or they came from Rhode Island by birth. And so their Baptist faith, as well as this shared experience in Rhode Island and their sympathies for free blacks and this new abolition generation, they all had this common core commitment that drove them back to one man. And they all looked back, whether it be Rhode Island or Baptist or abolitionist, they all saw themselves as coming downstream from Roger Williams. And so in honor of Roger Williams, they called the school the Roger Williams University. And that same year, almost for legal reasons as much as anything, an official president had to be listed, and Dr. Phillips was no longer interested in such a post, so the executive board appointed a guy named Dr. William B. Stewart of Canada to that post. Dr. Stewart was born in 1835 and died in 1912. So technically speaking, the first president of Roger Williams University was William B. Stewart. It could be said that that steals something from D.W. Phillips, but it could also be said that Dr. Phillips, being called the founder of the institution, steals something away from Dr. Wayland, who really started the whole project. So there's a lot of difficulty in figuring out who to start with when you're talking about Roger Williams University. But in any case, the year that Dr. Stewart began as the president and the school incorporated as a formal degree-granting institution, they expanded into fields that they had never explored before. And Dr. Phillips had predicted this. He knew that they would expand into secular works when they moved to be a full university. They began offering programs in what they called collegiate studies. They trained individuals for specialized graduate studies in both the classics and in science. They also had a program that they called biblical and theological studies. Of course, that's kind of self-explanatory. They had a program for academic studies where they prepared people for mathematics and English academic work. They had a normal studies program where they prepared people to be teachers in public schools. They had an English studies program where teachers were trained to work in rural one-room schoolhouses where they'd be expected to teach every subject to multiple grades. You think about what that would have been like, trying to figure out how to teach 11th graders and 1st graders in the same building, in the same classroom at the same time. They would have needed a special type of training to do that, especially when you were the only teacher and you couldn't really rely on any funding for textbooks. They also had a musical studies program for both vocal and instrumental training, and they didn't just train people for church work, although they did that, they also trained people for social circles. And finally, they had an industrial studies program where they would prepare students to make good use of themselves in trades. This would be what today we call trade school. So in one big gulp, the school became a massive undertaking with lots of programs preparing people to go into all kinds of fields, secular and religious alike. Now, less than a year into his presidency, Dr. Stewart resigned, and a guy named Edward D. Mitchell was appointed to the post on an interim basis. He was already serving as a professor of Hebrew and biblical interpretation. Notably, he was the first black man to ever graduate from an Ivy League school. He went to Dartmouth. But at this time, he was still very young. He had very little desire to take over a small, all-black school in Tennessee, especially when the biggest draw that they had to offer him was that they were in the process of completing a presidential home on campus. That house was still far from done. There was no noteworthy salary to mention. There was not really much promise of the career job lasting for very long. So you can understand why Dr. Mitchell wouldn't want the job. So he led the charge in finding a permanent president other than himself. And the guy that they brought in was a guy named William H. Stifler, S-T-I-F-L-E-R. I hope I'm saying that right. And Dr. Stifler was described as being a man full of energy and life. And you can kind of believe that, because when you look at his tenure as the president there, he was massively productive. He took on a lot of help. In September of 1884, the school starts saying, well, we've got 112 students right now and we'd like to grow. Well, by the time he left, 2 years later, the school had 248 students. All right? He more than doubled the size of their student body in 2 years. And they had the campus facilities just crammed to the max. There were 216 students that were boarded on campus, 32 of them commuting, and they had an equal balance, more or less, between men and women. They had 146 men and 102 females. And there were times that it's reported that they had to turn students away. There were students that had been admitted, that they had applied and been accepted to the school. They would show up and they would have to send them away. At one point they say we had to send 20 students away today because we don't have anywhere to put them. So the school just grew massively. And Dr. Stifler accommodated this growth by leading the university to construct a new hall called the Hayward Hall. They also finished the construction of the presidential house, and these two constructions alone combined to increase the value of the campus from $30,000 in 1874 to $80,000 in 1886. So he's tripled the value of the campus. He also led the university to begin collecting for an endowment, which had never been done before. And if you know much of anything about building universities or large institutions like this, oftentimes the endowment is where they start. So he obviously knew at least a little bit about institution building. He secured the first $1,000 toward the endowment before he departed, which was quite a sum at the time because the entire annual budget for the institution when he was there was $6,500 a year. He also hired 8 new individuals to work in administration. He expanded the collection of the library, bringing it to over 3,000 volumes. And finally, in his final full year as president, 1886, the Roger Williams University expanded its curriculum to begin offering master's degrees for the first time ever. So during the Stifler administration, there was remarkable improvement, especially given the fact that 4 years earlier, before he left, the school was not yet offering accredited bachelor degrees. And when he left, they were offering accredited master degrees. Now, during all of this, Dr. Stifler also seems to have been a singularly frugal and prudent man. Even when the presidential home was being completed, which you could consider that the only element of his work that would have been directly beneficial to himself, he saw it through that all of the woodwork that was being done on the presidential home, as well as all of the carpentry, all of the flooring, all of the lathing, all of the painting, and all of the hanging of doors and blinds was done by students in the industrial program. So he used the students who were learning how to do things like that, woodwork and painting and carpentry, to get free labor done so that the school wouldn't have to pay for that. This is an incredibly frugal thing to do, and a pretty wise thing, I think we'd have to admit. He also helped the university to go through these formative years as they figured out how to operate as a Baptist university. Dr. Phillips had been very afraid that they would go secular, and the students at the school, although they were getting a largely secular education, regardless of what field of study they were there to learn in, were required to attend chapel services. They also took recitation classes and Bible studies where they had to show that they were proficiently understanding the Bible in order to pass. They'd have to recite scriptures and recall knowledge from the Bible. And so while a person didn't have to be Baptist in order to attend, in fact, they didn't even have to be Christian to attend, the university was still markedly and convictionally Christian. At one point, they note that they had 35 students in the student body that were not even Christians. But by being constantly surrounded and influenced by the Christian nature of the university, even though it wasn't an institution that made you believe Christianity, they saw many people convert. For one example, in 1883, they reported 200 conversions on campus, both between students and visitors who were attending their chapel services. So this school was a Baptist university teaching secular programs to freed blacks and yet still maintaining a thoroughly Baptist, evangelistic, Christian flavor, if you wanted to use that sort of term. Now, with that said, I do have to hesitate when I'm talking about Dr. Stifler because in his final year, the university dove into the worst conflict of its existence thus far, and probably ever. In the winter of 1886 into 87, the students at Roger Williams University began to protest the actions of a man named T.E. Balk. He had been hired by Dr. Stifler to serve as the treasurer and the superintendent of industrial work. And through the 2 to 3 years that he'd been there, tensions had been growing between himself and the student body to such a degree that a report was made in the Nashville Star, which was a black newspaper at the time, that Mr. Balk, who was a white man, had so insulted a female student that the male students, said, this is the quote, would have used a rope to handle him if it were not for their continued respect for good old Dr. Phillips. So this actually brings in a pretty important point. all of the figures that I've named so far, all of these individuals who have played a part in founding and building this institution and teaching there, they have all been white. They have had no black leadership to this point, despite the fact that all of their students are black. And so this sort of reaches a boiling point with Mr. Balk because he seems to have, at least by what you read, some degree of belittlement of the black students there. And the students had made complaints to the trustees on that executive board we mentioned a few minutes ago. They'd also made complaints to the other faculty members, and they had all said that the faculty and the trustees sided with Balk. So the students drew up formal charges against Mr. Balk. They said these were the charges. I'm going to read these. Number 1, he has unfairly dealt with students in financial situations. Number 2, he has been unfair to a lady teacher who was white, as well as a young black student. Number 3, he has spoken contemptuously of Dr. D.W. Phillips, even objecting to a glass of milk being given to him at the university. And number 4, he has furnished nauseous food and accused students of theft. Now, when they leveled these charges and delivered them to President Stifler, he just refused to hear them. Flat out. He refused to hear the charges. He threatened to expel the 56 students who had signed the charges, and he refused to allow the students to appear before that local board of trustees, that executive board who had been formed when Dr. Phillips had resigned to oversee the ongoings of the institution. And so he just straight up blackballed them and stonewalled them and wouldn't allow them to be heard. But the students didn't leave this alone. In fact, they wrote to the board of the American Baptist Home Mission Society, which was in New York, not the local board in Nashville. They wrote to the board in New York that was funding and technically owned the institution, adding more charges, this time against Dr. Stifler. So they maintained the first 4 charges against Mr. Balk and added on 5 new charges against Dr. Stifler when speaking to the board in New York. These were the charges against Dr. Stifler. Number 1, non-recognition of the above charges, that is, those against Mr. Balk. Number 2, upholding immorality without regard for the truth and attempting to smother these threats, attempting to smother our attempts to reconcile by threats to expel those concerned and even expelling one already. Number 3, he uses abusive language, calling students fools, liars, stabbers, mobbers, and saying we are worse than the heathen in Africa because we present the above charges. Number 4, he refuses to let the matter come before the faculty and misrepresents us to the local board of trustees. And number 5, he uses religion deceptively as a means of carrying out his diabolical schemes. So they don't pull any punches on their accusations against Dr. Stifler, and if their accusations are true, then they shouldn't be pulling any punches, but this is quite a list of things that they've sent to the American Board of Home Mission Society back in New York. And in addition to this letter that they sent to them in New York, 2 different students, sent anonymous letters to Dr. Stifler and Mr. Balk themselves. Now, these are clearly written in 2 different hands, and given the language and the manner of speaking that they use, this is obviously 2 different students. Before I read these, I want to preface this by saying I only include these because they are rather useful in giving you an idea of how intense this conflict was between the students and the administration. There is language used here that I'm quite uncomfortable with, but I'm going to leave in without saying it. I'm going to spell words that I don't want to say so that you'll know what they are, but maybe they won't be too offensive to your ears. The first letter that was written, this was written to Dr. Stifler. It begins, "Old, bald, red-headed Stifler, you and your old white-headed Democrat are not wanted here, and if you don't move out, you'll both wish you had. If he does pat some of us on the back, we, Niggers, know what that is for. Your old red skull lies to us. You think we don't see through you, but we do, you old hypocrite. Your long prayers, you'd better for the lies you tell us. If you don't give us some milk and some things fit to eat, you and old Balk will get more rotten eggs around you than you'll want. Suppose the old white-headed Democrat don't know that his daughter makes love to one of us, Niggers. End quote. So that letter is colorful, to say the least. The second letter is oddly different, but no less pointed. It begins, Tom Balk, sir. The mood is so different. Sir, you have been making a reputation at our expense long enough, and if a stop is not put to it, you will suffer for it, and that soon. We give you a few days to give us better and more food and be more respectful to we students. You say you have a call from somewhere else, and we would be devilishly glad to know that you'd accepted it. The teachers pay the same for room and board that we do, but you and your clan of devils slip around and give them tea, milk, and extra dishes in order that they may stay shut-mouthed. We are going to petition the society to move you, and if it does not, we will move you, even if we have to do it in the dark. You dirty grand rascal, you think that Negroes are blind fools, but we will show you. You come here acting a dog and calling us rogues? We know how you said that you were going to kick Jody's ASS out of the office and other slight talk that you make to these poor boys. This is our home, and you dirty pup, we will kick your ASS out if you do not act better. End quote. So both of these letters, quite pointed, direct, and using variously colorful language, but despite continuing to write to the society in New York, the students reflected on a marked silence on their end of the line for many months. But this was not due to inaction per se. The society had 2 meetings to regard this conflict in January of 1887. They had another 4 meetings to discuss it in February. And finally, on February 21st, they issued a resolution saying that they had investigated the claims, but they deemed the claims, quote, unfounded, trivial, or susceptible of explanation. And so in response, on the 28th of February, 117 students filed for dismissal from the school, and they promised to be off campus by March the 3rd. And the faculty voted to approve the request, but they also voted to write to the board in New York and request the dismissal of Dr. Stifler and Mr. Balk. So after February 28th of 1887, the school was effectively closed for a while, trying to figure out how to move forward. Now, Stifler went public with the fiasco, and he called it a student rebellion. And the faculty responded to his public statement saying the students, here's a quote, are not in rebellion, they have been honorably dismissed. So there was a disconnect even between the faculty members and Dr. Stifler. But on March the 3rd, the president of the ABHMS, a guy named Edward C. Hiscox, he telegraphed Dr. Phillips in Nashville, and he asked him to keep the students from leaving until further advice had been given. Stifler, on the other hand, took the opportunity to encourage the students to leave. He posted a notice saying students entitled to them can get reduced fare permits by calling the office. So he's trying to give them a discount just to leave because he wants them out of there. But the board in New York met again on March the 5th, this time with Dr. Dake present representing the Nashville school, and they agreed to dismiss both Stifler and Balk. They appointed a guy named William E. Morang, who was a professor at Roger Williams for only 3 years, to be the new president. And on the news of this, the students began responding just elatedly. They signed an explanation and an apology. They stated that they regretted the language that they used, but they felt at the time that it was needed due to incompetent, unwise, and injurious actions against them. And one would imagine that that would kind of be the end of it, that everybody would just move on. But just unimaginably, there was a guy who was the corresponding secretary of the board in New York, the Home Mission Board in New York. He was their corresponding secretary, and he receives this explanation and apology from the students. His name was Henry L. Morehouse. And I don't mind telling you, I don't think very highly of Henry L. Morehouse, given what I've read in this study. He was the central point of contact through this conflict, and when he received the explanation and apology from the students, he took offense to it. And so he writes back on May the 9th that the 2 graduating students who had participated in this event should not be allowed to graduate, and that all the other students who intended to continue attending the university who had participated in this rebellion were no longer permitted to attend. So he says, expel them anyway. Just expel them anyway. And the executive board there in Nashville, the local one that was actually overseeing and guiding the university, was completely dumbfounded by this. So they just refused to obey, and they allowed all the students who were due to graduate to do so on May 24th, and all the rest to matriculate and to continue attending. And they claimed that they had the right to do this legally, even though the ABHMS board commanded something different. They said that the ABHMS board didn't have the right to stop them. They said that the students had good cause for complaints against the administration on behalf of their personal conduct. And they even said that Stifler and Bulk were in the wrong. They even alluded to the belittling acts of the New York board, who had failed to respond for several months. And so the board in Nashville seems to take the side of the student body, while the board in New York seems to take the side of Dr. Stifler and Mr. Bulk, although they did agree to dismiss them. Now, we actually know who the two students were that the New York board didn't want to graduate. It was S.W. Anderson and E.I. Sadler, and they both received bachelor degrees that year anyway, and Anderson was immediately elected president of the Alumni Association. So you get the idea that everybody on the ground agrees with the students and thinks that Dr. Stifler and Mr. Bulk were just jerks that deserved whatever happened to them. But this was absolutely a breaking point in relations between the school itself and the American Baptist Home Mission Society in New York. They immediately lost all sense of connection. Even though the ABHMS continued funding and even played a large role in the administration and the hiring of faculty, the connection was really strained after this. The guy that they designated to be the new president, Dr. Meringue, he was so stressed by all this that only a month after graduation, on the 30th of June, 1887, he died. He was only 37 years old, and he'd only been the president for 4 months, but the stress of this whole situation literally killed him. Now, the board in New York wrote to the board in Nashville, and they said, in not so many words, that they expected moving forward to have complete control over the university that they funded and whose property they were in ownership of. And the board in Nashville wrote back, and they claimed that the charter of the institution made no such statement of authority on behalf of the ABHMS, but it actually gave control to the university, regardless of who had originally purchased the property or who had funded the budget. And so as a consequence, the entire Nashville board resigned, with the exception of Dr. Phillips, and on Dr. Phillips alone fell the responsibility of conveying this news to the New York board. And when he sent this letter to them, he did so with the words, "I feel mortified." That was all that he said, conveying them this letter from the Nashville board saying, you don't have the right to do this, along with their resignations. Their resignations it's odd to me when people do that in history, when they say, I refuse to bow to your authority and I also quit. That sort of thing just doesn't make much sense to me, but that's what they did. In September of 1888, Henry Morehouse was scheduled to come to Nashville, ironically, to have a conference between the ABHMS and black organizations. And Dr. Dake, when Dr. Morehouse got to Nashville, Dr. Dake asked him to hash things out with the university. He said that he wanted him to restore right feelings between the late trustees and himself. And Morehouse responded by saying that he had too much self-respect to even continue further communications with Dr. Dake. And so he comes to this meeting, and he and others recognized that there was a noteworthy reconciliation going on between Northern Baptist and Southern Baptist, and that blacks in both conventions could probably see a future where they would come together. And that ultimately happened just a few years later when the National Baptist Convention, which was a black Baptist organization of their own, was founded. But there in the moment in 1888, it seemed that Northern and Southern Baptists were agreed on one thing. They wanted to establish a black Baptist university to serve black Baptists on a nationwide scale. And Roger Williams University was suggested to be the prime candidate for that national university if they would be willing to move the school somewhere else. Now, although these talks of establishing Roger Williams as the premier black Baptist university in America might sound grand, they actually spelled out the beginning of the end. Because those individuals presently benefiting from Roger Williams were less than enthusiastic about the idea of it growing by leaving. With Dr. Phillips passing in 1890, his ambitious ideas for the university were entirely lost, and all that remained were those who had received it from him. So talks about selling the campus began to grow, and the property was evaluated in preparation for a sale. The move was expected at any time, and the property evaluation valued the campus at $150,000. And so you'd expect that they would begin entertaining offers. But just as things were getting close to sale, on the 29th of March, 1891, all of the black churches in Nashville voted to ask the executive board in New York not to sell the campus, purely because it was memorable to them and in the memory of Dr. Phillips, who had only passed a year earlier. And they pledged their might behind the school if the board in New York just wouldn't sell it. And only the next month, an offer came from a guy named Alexander Bradford, who was a real estate agent, and he offered the value of $150,000 for the school with a provision that they could stay there for 6 months after his purchasing it in order to find a new location suitable for the university to move to. And the board in New York, seeking to appease the churches, which were against selling it anyway, responded in June with a counteroffer. They wanted $225,000, and they wanted Bradford to locate for them a suitable replacement site worth not less than $25,000 already, and they gave him 90 days to do it. Okay, so he offered $150,000, which is what the school's worth. They come back, they say they want $225,000, plus for him to find them a campus of $25,000 value in 90 days or less. So naturally, Bradford declined, and soon things just went from bad to worse. The residential areas of Nashville were expanding in this time, and the Jim Crow laws of the era oftentimes explicitly divided who could live where on racial grounds. And so just as white neighborhoods were pressing ever closer to the Roger Williams campus, the board knew that its days were numbered. And so maybe the churches thought that they could fight against this encroachment, but the force was just too much to oppose. And so a new local board in Nashville was brought on, and they were largely hand-selected by the board in New York. And they began bringing on faculty members that would support more of the ideas in the New York board. That was begun with the hiring of a guy named John Hope. In 1894, John Hope graduated from Brown University. He had been born in 1868 in Augusta, Georgia. His father was white, his mother was black. And so John Hope was an interesting-looking kind of guy because he had blonde hair and blue eyes, but he had brown skin. So while he identified with a black man, he had this white background that made him, I guess, a lot more acceptable to whites of the era. And so the board in New York, still led by Morehouse, thought that he was a great guy to bring in to try to bridge the gap between the black churches in Nashville and the whites who were trying to get them out. Of course, the New York board wanted the school to leave anyway and go somewhere else. And so Morehouse brings him in, and John Hope is supposed to be a major figure in the school, leading them away from where they were right then towards the idea, the goal that the New York board had in mind. Now, John Hope was a highly sought-after figure. He had been offered a job at the Tuskegee Institute upon his graduation from Brown, but he declined it because the Tuskegee Institute was, of course, under the thumb of a guy named Booker T. Washington, who had a very, you could say, accommodationist view of how to gain respect for the black community. If you read some of Booker T. Washington's writings from especially the World War I era, he is oddly accommodationist. He thought that black people should volunteer to serve in the military in World War I so as to show their white co-citizens that they were civilized people worth respecting. So he had a very different view of how to build racial comedy between blacks and whites than the average black at the time. And John Hope was much more assertive, much more confrontational in his approach than Booker T. Washington affirmed. And so he didn't want to work for him at Tuskegee. And so although for the moment things were racially amicable at Roger Williams, John Hope was going to come in and begin agitating to try to move the blacks and the whites further away from one another and make it such that the black leaders of Roger Williams University would support moving the school somewhere else away from this encroaching white community that was coming in, and they would be willing to take the money from this white community that wanted to develop it into white neighborhoods. So John Hope begins doing this. He's agitating against what he considered apathetic people in the area. One student described the situation before he arrived. They said that on one side of the road was Roger Williams University, on the other side was Vanderbilt. To get to Nashville, Roger Williams students crossed the road and cut across the Vanderbilt campus to the trolley line. Relations between the two schools were entirely friendly. Vanderbilt students came over to join in religious meetings at the Colored College. Roger Williams boys waited on tables at Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt football coaches coached the Negro teams at Roger Williams. The Roger Williams students went to the games at Vanderbilt and sat with the others on the bleachers, a practice which would not be allowed years later. Individual students, white and black, formed friendships that outlasted school days. So there was an amicability between the white and the blacks in the area before John Hope arrived. In his 4 years teaching there between 1894 and 1898, that changed. John Hope felt that blacks in the area were not aware of the fragility of their circumstances. And alongside teaching natural science, Latin, and Greek, he began making public agitation speeches on race relations. To give an example, in 1896 he made a speech in which he said, quote, "Let us not fool ourselves, nor be fooled by others. If we cannot do what other free men do, then we are not free. Yes, I want total equality, nothing less. I want all that my God-given powers will enable me to get. Why not?" Now, today we look at that and we say, yeah, sure. But in their day, you got to understand, this was a pretty hard thing to swallow, given that they were 30 years removed from slavery. Both whites and blacks had a hard time envisioning the day when both would just live amongst one another in total equality. And so given that most in the area were convinced that there was an inherent goodness in the separate but equal that they were experiencing, the blacks seeing the institution Roger Williams University as a good thing for them and their communities, and the whites seeing Roger Williams University as a good thing in that it kept blacks out of white schools but was also a good school for them, his agitation was certainly unwelcome by locals, and it didn't do any favors for the people who were trying to keep Roger Williams in Nashville. As agitation like this became more regular and rejections of offers to buy the campus by the real estate developers were more frequent, keep in mind the local board there, even though it was still mostly dominated by New York board-selected men, they still had to deal with the fact that the local community didn't want to sell the campus. And so you have this catch-22, where the faculty in John Hope are agitating and making things difficult for the people who live there and difficult for the people who are on campus and the students and the local community, and there's this rising tension, but nevertheless the people don't want the school to leave. And so it reaches a boiling point at the turn of the 20th century. In 1903, proposals to elevate the Peabody Normal College to a full college for teachers were approved, and the state of Tennessee and the local county and the city of Nashville all made financial commitments to make sure that this school became a full college for teachers. Now, Chancellor Kirkland of Vanderbilt immediately began campaigning for Peabody to be moved closer to his school because he wanted a teacher school nearby for the mutual strengthening of both institutions. That same year, 1903, students at Roger Williams University were rehearsing in the chapel for a musical event that they were going to be putting on soon, and bullets began to come flying through the chapel windows. Nobody was hurt, so they moved on. Christmas Day, 1904, a year later, someone again began firing a gun, this time through the window of the presidential home. And at that point, President Peter Guernsey's wife was shot. Now, she survived, but these would unfortunately only serve as harbingers of what was to come. Almost exactly a month after the presidential home shooting, on the 24th of January, 1905, most of the Roger Williams students had gathered in the chapel of Centennial Hall for a 7 p.m. prayer meeting. And one male student who was walking home from his job as a waiter at Vanderbilt looked up and he saw flames rising out of the roof of the building where everyone was gathered. He screamed to alert everyone, and although miraculously everyone got out, the unfortunate fact that the campus was outside of the city limits prohibited them from receiving any support from the fire department. There's multiple things to be said about that. Suffice it to say, there was no piped water. They didn't have water lines outside the city limits. So it could be a point for prejudice, But I think it's more just practicality. The fact that they were outside the city limits, the fire department couldn't help them. So everyone formed a bucket brigade to try to put the fire out, but by the morning of the next day, the entire Centennial Hall had been destroyed. And it took with it the entire science library and the personal possessions of 160 male students who all lived there. Describing the scenes on campus the next day, the Nashville American reported, "The campus was covered in ash and debris, all from the conflagration. Around the residences of President Guernsey and Treasurer Owen, groups of students stood with quilts and blankets wrapped around them, waiting for orders and money from the officers that they might return home or look for a permanent place to live." And that day, actually, very tragically, turned out to be one of the coldest days in Nashville's history. So many of the students ended up finding shelter in nearby homes. And the school, just shockingly, moved on like nothing had happened. They restarted classes a week later. In the months that followed, there were conflicting reports over whether the building would be rebuilt or not. They reported that there was no signs of arsony, that it was something along the lines of a failure in some of the roofing. So in February, the Nashville board passed a resolution saying that they would agree to sell the campus if they received an offer of at least $180,000. On the March the 19th, this was a month later, the Nashville American reported that a local real estate company had offered to buy the campus again, and they had plans to subdivide it for residences. The school treasurer, Mr. Owen, confirmed that the offer had been made and even offered the information that the offer was for $300,000. So that's almost twice what the board said they would sell it for. But shockingly, and again, I have no explanation for this, H.L. Morehouse in New York sent a telegram instructing the university not to sell and to announce that they had plans to continue normal operation in the buildings that remained. It's inexplicable. I have no idea why. He's spent the entire time building this new board in Nashville so that they'll sell the campus, to only have an offer submitted that's nearly double what the new board that you made agreed to sell it for, and then you personally send a telegram saying don't sell it. Okay, so what do we do now? Well, predictably, 2 months later, on the night of the 22nd of May, the main building on campus, known as the Mansion House, that historic old Gordon home, it also burst into flames. It had been used as a classroom building and a library and the girls' dormitory. And because the school was out of session for the summer, there was only one man in the building that night, and he reported to the Nashville American that he, quote, heard a noise coming from the first floor as if someone was falling over furniture. But hearing nothing further, I went back to sleep, only to be awakened an hour later by cries from outside of the fire. And once more, without running water available, given that they were outside the city limits, there was no response from the fire department, and the entire building, including the now 6,000-volume library, burned to the ground. And President Guernsey said that he received many calls from prominent citizens, both ladies and gentlemen, who complimented me on the good behavior of our students and called upon me at my home to express personal sympathy and regret. And so because of this, President Guernsey didn't believe that there was some sort of organized effort to remove the school, but he instead blamed what he called some drunken tramp or a daredevil or some harebrained miscreant with a mania for destroying school property in general. Now, his comments about having a mania for destroying school property in general is an allusion to something else that's sometimes used to say that there was no arsony. That same era, about a month before that the second building burned down, there was a building at Vanderbilt University that burned down. But it's important to note, I looked into this, the building that burned down at Vanderbilt burned down in the middle of the day. It went ablaze at 11 o'clock in the morning. Both of the buildings at Roger Williams burst into flames at night, one time with the only person in the building saying he heard people downstairs tripping over furniture in the dark. So I don't think there's any speculation. These buildings were burned down. They had been shot at in the previous years. They were burned down. And so, of course, with very little remaining on the campus, the ABHMS finally closed the campus, and they transferred the students to the Atlanta Baptist College, which would later be called Morehouse College. And guess who it was named after? H.L. Morehouse. And guess who was the president of that college when they named it Morehouse College? John Hope, the guy that he had sent down to start this whole fight so that they could move the college in Nashville anyway. It just runs all over me. So, having little recourse, the Nashville board attempts to sell the campus. And they first offered the entire 28-acre campus to a buyer that they believed would be interested. It's probably the guy who had just offered them $300,000 a few months earlier. But they found that that buyer had moved on and was no longer interested in the property. So they continued having difficulty finding a buyer, even though they lowered their asking price from the $180,000 that they had agreed on to $150,000, which was what they felt that it was worth, even though that appraisal included the buildings that were now burned down. Finally, they agreed to have the property subdivided and sold as residential lots, and they were going to do that themselves, and that began in 1906, with the board having as their chief local advisor a guy named Adolphus B. Hill, who was himself a Baptist layman. So they knew that they could trust this guy. And although it's true that Mr. Hill probably got the board the best deal that they could expect to get, he was nevertheless a property developer. So he saw to it that the property was appropriately subdivided into building lots. He brought water lines and gas lines in. He had sidewalks and streets paved. And he negotiated an extension of the streetcar line to make sure that the streetcars would reach the new neighborhood. And all this sounds great, but he also, of course, being a product of his time, and because it was a property development that he expected to have to sell, included in the new deeds a restriction that the new properties could not be sold to, quote, any person of African blood or descent. And this is exactly what all the black churches knew would happen if the property was sold. But interestingly, much of the old campus eventually found its way under the ownership of Peabody College anyway, which today came under the ownership of Vanderbilt University. So with most of their campus having burned to the ground, there was not much left. The Nashville board quietly purchased a tract of land a few blocks east at Rocky Hill. It was about 30 acres anyway, which kind of brought them back to ground zero. But control of the university was almost undesirable, even for the board, who spent two more years trying to figure out what to do. The alumni of Roger Williams University blamed the New York board, the ABHMS board, for the whole downfall. One alumnus wrote in a public article published on the 19th of April, 1907, "Beautiful Roger Williams University is no more. The buildings were destroyed by fire. The insurance money was collected and carried to New York or somewhere else, and the campus has been cut up into residential lots and is being sold under an agreement that no Negro will be allowed to live there except as a servant. This arrangement was made by a society posing as an agency to do Christian missionary work." He's speaking of the ABHMS there. "The Negroes have become disgusted with such hypocrisy and have determined to erect a Roger Williams University themselves and conduct the same as they see fit." End quote. So the blame for this was laid at the feet of the ABHMS, and quite frankly, I can't blame them. I don't disagree. A few months after that article was published, in July of 1907, there was a black organization known as the Baptist Missionary and Educational Convention of Tennessee, and they met with the Nashville board, which offered them control of the university. So what's happening here is the Nashville board is saying, we don't want any part of this. The ABHMS has just sailed us down the river. We want you to take over as controlling leaders of Roger Williams University. And so the convention did choose to do this. They chose to move the university to a 12-acre site on White's Creek Pike and approved a new board of trustees that was more local. And in the fall of that year, a new dormitory and classroom building was erected on the new site. The school officially opened on the 1st of January 1908. They had 100 students and 7 teachers. A guy named J.W. Johnson, who was a graduate of George Washington University, was the new president. And by the way, J.W. Johnson, this new president, who was made the president by the new local board of trustees elected by this Baptist Missionary and Educational Convention of Tennessee, was the first black man to ever serve in administration over the university. Now, they had black people on faculty, like John Hope, for example, but they had never had a black man in administration. J.W. Johnson became the first black man the school had ever had in administration. And humorously, the ABHMS, still largely influenced by H.L. Morehouse, maintained, even past this point, that it still owned the university regardless of anything that Nashville board did. Now, after 14 years, the school reported in 1922 that it still only had 159 students and 12 faculty members, which is roughly half of where it had been a few decades earlier. And despite efforts to raise an endowment, efforts which were largely successful when compared to other institutions' efforts in the era, the financial woes of the school simply never recovered. The financial crash of 1929 spelled the end for Roger Williams University, and on 29th of December 1929, the university officially merged with the only other Baptist university in Tennessee for black students, Howe Institute, which is now known as Lemoyne-Owen College in Memphis. Talks had been ongoing about this merger for 2 years already when it finally occurred, but this had to have been a humbling experience for the people who remembered the Roger Williams University's glory days, because the Howe Institute in Memphis had actually been created by Roger Williams graduates. And until the fires of 1905, Roger Williams University was the largest black Baptist university in America. I want to conclude today by talking about some of the famous alumni. They're not really famous, to be honest with you. I'd never heard of a single one of these people before doing this study, but they are noteworthy alumni that came out of this school that you should know. The first one I've spoken of briefly already was Hardin Smith. He was one of the first students at Roger Williams University before it was even called that. He was born a slave in 1829, one of 7 children of his owner, Abner Smith, and his mother, Liddy, who was one of Abner's slaves. He was sold at the age of 11, and his new owner's wife, Miss Ruth Loving, secretly and notably illegally taught him to read. And Hardin soon secretly taught others to read, and by the age of 16 got permission to minister to slaves in night meetings at the Woodlawn Baptist Church of Nutbush, I'm not sure how to say that, as well as being a secret slave leader in a congregation near the Hatchie River in Brownsville. And after training at Roger Williams, he helped organize the Howe Institute in Memphis that we just spoke of, as well as helping to organize the National Negro Baptist Convention. He had 22 children and died at the age of 100. Another is Martin Winfield, who along with Hardin Smith was one of the first students at Roger Williams. These were the 2 guys that were scholarshiped by the ABHMS. He was born a slave of a merchant in around 1831, and Winfield's owner taught him how to read, and he went on to become a very successful Baptist minister. The year the Civil War ended, he attended Roger Williams and subsequently started the First Baptist Church of Brownsville. Only 2 years following, he began starting schools in the area to replicate what he had accomplished in his own home when he had educated his own 2 children to literacy, which was an uncommon task for former slaves to be able to accomplish. He was said to have owned $250 in real estate at the time, in addition to having $250 in other possessions, which was quite a sum for a newly freed slave. He died in 1883 at about 52 years old. William Madison McDonald was another. He was born in Texas a year after the Civil War ended to 2 formerly enslaved parents. William was sent to Roger Williams University to get an education, and immediately upon graduation returned to Texas to begin a career. He started out as a high school principal before becoming active in the Republican Party. In 1892, although only 26 years old, he was elected to the executive committee of the Texas State Republican Party, and he would serve as a powerful force in Republican state politics for over 30 years, as well as becoming a powerful figure amongst Freemasons and bankers. He founded the first black-owned bank in Fort Worth, and this bank was so successful that it was one of the few that actually persevered through the Great Depression. According to a 2008 report by the Dallas Morning News, McDonald was most likely the first black millionaire in Texas history. Allen Allensworth is another that we previously mentioned in brief. He was born a slave in 1842 and was sold several times throughout his early years. He escaped during the Civil War, joining the 44th Illinois Volunteers as a Union soldier, and after the war he began teaching free blacks how to read and write. He sought training on how to better do this at Roger Williams University in 1868, and he received a Master of Arts, later being ordained as a Baptist minister. He'd go on to be appointed as a chaplain in the U.S. Army before deploying with the Buffalo Soldiers in 1886. He served 20 years in the Army, becoming the first black man to ever reach the rank of lieutenant colonel. He died in 1914. William Herbert Brewster, Sr. This guy was a pastor, a poet, a playwright, a civil rights leader, and perhaps most influentially, a musician and a songwriter. William H. Brewster Sr. was born on the 2nd of July, 1897, and he served as a pastor of the East Trigg Avenue Baptist Church in South Memphis from 1930 until his death in 1987. Now, you think about that era, 1930 to 1987, as a pastor in Memphis. You talk about a civil rights figure. He graduated from Roger Williams in 1922. Some of those later years, he was probably one of the last noteworthy graduates. He's best remembered as the author of over 200 published songs, several of which hold the distinction of having been the first million-selling black gospel records. There was one young man who was known to attend his church for many years, a young boy named Elvis Presley. And when Presley was on the road, he made a point to listen to Brewster on the radio and said that both Brewster's messages and musical talents held his attention when he was a child. Newell Houston Inslee was another figure that graduated from Roger Williams. He was born a slave in Nashville on the 23rd of August, 1852. His grandfather was the white owner of the family, which gained him the ability to learn to read and write with the other white children of the family. During the Civil War, he ran away and hid in the Union Army camps, but after the war, he was forced to return to his grandfather's farm, and he worked as a paid laborer until his grandfather died the next year in 1866. In February of 1871, he entered Roger Williams University to study in the classical program, and he began preaching and singing gospel music regularly while also touring the North. Now, who do you think he toured with? He toured with Dr. D.W. Phillips as a representative of the home mission schools. And to be honest with you, I think somebody needs to write something about D.W. Phillips. This guy sounds really, really cool. He sounds like a good guy. In June of 1878, Newell Inslee graduated third in his class from the Newton Theological Seminary, and upon graduation he took a position as professor of theology and Latin at Shaw University, and later a professorate at Howard University teaching rhetoric, Hebrew, and science. He would later hold a final professorate at Alcorn University teaching rhetoric, natural sciences, and vocal music until his death in 1888. Not to neglect the ladies, Miss Betty Hill, born Rebecca Jane Lapsley around 1876 in Nashville, studied religion at Roger Williams before marrying a Buffalo soldier named Abraham Houston Hill. Later in life, after her husband left the military, she and her family settled in Los Angeles, California, where she became an adamant civil rights activist fighting against the sort of homeowners association actions that had pushed blacks out of neighborhoods like Roger Williams had experienced. She was a vocal part of what has become known as the swimming pool case in Los Angeles in 1931, wherein blacks were banned from public swimming pools. She was a major part of black history in California. I'd encourage you to look into her. Betty Hill. She died in 1960. Elijah P. Mars. Born a slave in January 1840, he received night education from a Christian man at his church named Ham Graves. On the 25th of September 1864, he organized a group of 27 slaves, and they brazenly marched to the Union camp nearby to enlist. And he later became the first black teacher in Simpsonville, Kentucky. He fought in the public sector to defeat a whipping post bill, which unbelievably would have made whipping a legal punishment for black people who had committed crimes. He became a marked enemy of the Ku Klux Klan. He was asked to come and teach at Roger Williams in 1874, just 5 years before he and his brother Henry founded Simmons College of Kentucky. He died on the 30th of August, 1910. Inman E. Page. He was born a slave on the 29th of December, 1853. His family went through a great deal to procure their son a best education, as best as a slave could have possibly. Inman and his friend George W. Milford became the first black students to ever enroll at Brown University in 1873. In 1874, he won an oratorical contest which began a series of great speaking opportunities, one of which was a class speech day on which he delivered a speech called The Intellectual Prospects of America. And who was present for that speech? None other than D.W. Phillips, the president of Roger Williams University. He approached Inman after the speech and asked him about becoming a professor at Natchez Seminary, which was another ABHMS seminary, and he accepted that upon graduation in 1877. He'd go on to become the president at 4 other schools, the Lincoln Institute, the Langston University, the Western University, and finally, Roger Williams University itself. He died on the 21st of December, 1935. Chastine C. Stoom. Born on the 11th of April, 1848, Stuhm was born in a Kentucky farming town in Muhlenberg County, and as a black man he caused quite a stir by attending an all-white school in Greenville for some time because the teacher agreed to give him private lessons so that he could go to college. He initially went to Berea College in 1871, but transferred after a couple of years to Roger Williams University, and during his college years he became a very highly sought-after newspaper reporter. He wrote for no fewer than 8 different periodicals. Upon graduation and ordination, he began planting and pastoring churches, which he successfully continued doing for a couple of decades. He was awarded an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree from the University of Louisville in 1890. He died on the 9th of November, 1895. Randall B. Vanderval. We spoke about him briefly being one of the early trustees. He was born a slave in 1832 and was permitted to learn how to spell at a young age, beginning preaching at the age of 16. He managed to convince his owner to allow him to purchase his own freedom, agreeing to the sum of $1,800. He became the pastor of the African mission planted by the Spruce Street Baptist Church in 1862, but when this mission dissolved, the church's new pastor recruited him to create a college to train black preachers, and that new preacher who recruited him to create this college was none other than Daniel W. Phillips. So Dr. Phillips became the first president of the university, and Vanderval became the first trustee. Phillips would go on to legally marry Vanderval to his wife, and Vanderval would go on to plant several churches, and as well as open many new schools. He would be elected as the president of the Tennessee Sunday School Convention and received an honorary doctorate of divinity from Roger Williams University in 1886. He died in 1898. Samuel Henry Clay Owen. Now, although little is known about S.H.C. Owen, we do know he was born in Durhamville, Tennessee on the 6th of March, 1856. He received only 3 months of formal education before enrolling at the Roger Williams University, where he completed both the normal course and the collegiate courses before leaving in 1885. He accepted immediately the position of principal at Brownsville Public School, resigning to take a professorship at Natchez College in Natchez, Mississippi. He was promoted to president in 1889, but resigned to take a professorship at Howe Normal and Bible Institute in Memphis. You'll see a lot of these names are recurring. It's all one big thing going on. It's a big network. Only a year later, he returned and reassumed the presidency at Natchez, and he would keep this position until 1929. He'd retire and live another 10 years before dying on the 26th of May, 1939, at the age of 83. Charles Spencer Dinkins. Born a slave, he would become the valedictorian of the 1877 class before going on to Newton Theological Institute, where he graduated with a master's in 1881. He later received a Doctor of Divinity from the State University of Louisville in 1890 and became president of the Alabama Baptist Colored University in Selma, now Selma University, in 1893. He died on the 19th of September, 1901, at the age of 45. Interestingly, a quote of his is kept by nature of having been penned inside the cover of a book that he gave his son. The quote is this: "Read this book, my boy, and learn what our people have suffered, have done, what we are suffering, and what we are doing. Resolve by the grace of God to make your mark in the world by helping to free them from civil and political oppression." Daisy Miller Harvey. Mrs. Harvey was born in Mississippi but reared in Memphis, Tennessee, where she attended the public schools and later Lemaine Institute. In September of 1877, she entered the Roger Williams University and was graduated from the normal course in 1879. She began at once to teach, and with the exception of 1 year, has been engaged in educational work continuously for 19 years following. In 1885, she was appointed by the Women's Baptist Educational Society as their missionary. She's quoted as saying, "I traveled through the state of Kentucky from east to west and from north to south, visiting churches, organizing missionary bands, making special talks to the young people, visiting the homes, and helping when I could to encourage the women to live pure, clean lives and to make their homes all they ought to be, types of the heavenly home." In 1884, Mrs. Harvey began a movement which has resulted in the establishment of the Colored Orphans and Old Ladies Home, and from 1896 on, Mrs. Harvey was a matron in Bishop College, Marshall, Texas. She'd die in 1933. Joseph A. Booker. Born a slave on the 26th of December 1859, his mother died when he was 1, and his father was whipped to death when he was 3 for teaching the other slaves how to read. Upon the end of the Civil War, he was enrolled in some of the earliest public schools ever made available to black students. He became a licensed Baptist minister at the age of 16. And from 1878 to 1881, he attended what would later become the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff before moving to Nashville in 1881 to attend Roger Williams University. He achieved a bachelor's degree in classics in 1886, and in 1887, while serving as a pastor, he was appointed to be the first president of the Arkansas Baptist College, a post he would hold until his death. He married Mary Jane Carver, a fellow student at Roger Williams, in 1887. They had 8 children together. He served in Arkansas alongside Booker T. Washington to bring race relations to a better place, and was even asked by Governor Charles Hillman Breaux to promote interracial justice following the 1919 Elaine massacre, in which over 100 blacks were killed. Maris T. Kinney. Maris graduated from the college department in 1887, going on to teach in the public schools in Tennessee, as well as at Natchez College, in Mississippi, Roger Williams University, Howe Institute, and the Arkansas Baptist College. So it's all coming full circle here. Last one of these. Walter H. Brooks. Born a slave on the 30th of August, 1851, his father purchased his mother's freedom for $800, as well as 2 of the older children, but he was not able to purchase for 7 other children before being sold elsewhere. Following the Civil War, Mr. Brooks attended several colleges with the intention of becoming a Presbyterian minister, but in 1873 he changed his mind on the issue of baptism. He became a major figure in the formation of the National Baptist Convention, that's the Black Baptist Convention we spoke of earlier, and in addition to at least 2 others, he was an 1889 recipient of an honorary doctorate of divinity from Roger Williams University. He died on the 6th of July, 1945. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Baptist Directory. Again, I'm Dr. Michael Schultz, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.